Have you ever wondered what would happen if you just stopped going to work? Would anyone outside of your immediate workplace even notice? Would society come to a screeching halt? Would something crucial stop functioning? Or would it just mean one less person in the Zoom room, one less cog in the machine that keeps on spinning anyway? Chances are life would go on virtually unchanged, revealing just how meaningless your daily labor might be. Now, if this question made you uncomfortably pause, you're not alone. According to the Harvard Business Review, nearly 40% of workers believe that their jobs contribute nothing meaningful to society. That's millions and millions of people every single day going to work, doing work they deem meaningless and possibly even deadening. But if that's true, if your work doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, why have you attached so much of your self-worth onto your job? We tie our entire identities to employment status.
I'm a mechanic.
Okay, so lots of important questions to unpack here. Today, we're going to be diving into one of society's most pervasive yet unexamined contradictions: how we simultaneously hate our jobs and deem them meaningless, and yet tie our entire value as human beings to said jobs. This episode, we're going to explore why the 9 to 5 work model still persists despite mounting evidence of its ineffectiveness, how it serves more as a control mechanism rather than a productivity optimizer, and finally, why feeling shame about unemployment is perhaps an irrational emotional response to a perfectly normal economic condition. Let's start with the aforementioned fact. So, anthropologist David Graeber found that nearly 50% of the workforce believes that their labor contributes nothing meaningful to society. Yet, when unemployment strikes, many feel shame, isolation, and a profound loss of identity. I mean, just what inspired this episode is my own shame, isolation, and profound loss of identity during unemployment. So I would know. But the question is why? Why have we attached our fundamental worth as human beings to jobs we ourselves know are meaningless? When we look at the modern workplace, particularly in America, though generalizable to many developing countries, we find a landscape that is littered with what David Graeber terms bullshit jobs. These are not just unpleasant jobs. These are jobs that shouldn't exist at all. Think about it. Why do we need 12 layers of management to approve a single document? Why do we need a brand consultant who doesn't actually do anything of value? Why do we need an entire career about making PowerPoints, about making other PowerPoints? If that's a thing. I'm pretty sure it's a thing. If the goal is productivity and optimizing productivity, it all seems a little counterintuitive, does it not? Graeber identifies 5 types of bullshit jobs that dominate our economy today. First are flunkies, those who only exist to make their bosses feel important. These are people like receptionists in largely automated environments. Second, we have goons, people whose jobs exist only because other corporations or industries have them. Think corporate lawyers or PR specialists. Third, we have the duct tapers, people who only exist because the system is flawed. So think IT specialists who spend all day fixing problems in a poorly designed system. Fourth, we have the box tickers. So these are people that exist to say you're doing something without actually doing something. Think of diversity, equity, and inclusion officers who are there to make you feel like the company is doing anything for diversity, equity, and inclusion, but don't actually have the power to do anything. Finally, and my least favorite, the taskmasters. Dun dun dun. Now, these people justify their existence by basically just creating needless work. These are the people who manage others who don't necessarily need managing and spend all day creating meaningless and pointless paperwork for others to sign. These aren't just abstract categories, they're lived experiences for millions of Americans. But the thing is, Americans are catching on. And, well, again, I'm using America as a case study, but this is generalizable to many other developed countries. We're catching on. We're seeing content on TikTok, on Instagram, saying, oh, my only job in life is to clickety clackety on a laptop, copy paste, create Excel spreadsheets.
Some people ask what I do for work. I'm like, I email. I got one of those email jobs. Someone, this is really what I do all week. Someone sends me an email, and then I send it to somebody else. I go, hey, can you respond back to this? That's all I do.
And people feel that profound loss of meaning and purpose. They know that they spend 8 to 9 hours a day doing nothing to add to society. Yet, here is where the contradiction arises. We know our jobs are meaningless, but without those jobs, we would lose our identity. But it's not necessarily our fault we feel this way. Society has constructed an entire identity framework where unemployment, regardless of reason, is treated as a moral failing. A great illustration of this is a man who was quoted in Psychology Today. He says, I never told you this, but last year I was unemployed for 5 months. The worst time for me was when I got up in the morning. I was too embarrassed to go out. I felt like I was in a prison until 5 in the afternoon when I could leave my apartment. I didn't want anybody to know that I was unemployed. And believe it or not, I did the very same thing for a long time. At the beginning of my unemployment, I would go outside and then quickly remember that I was unemployed, and if anybody saw me outside on a Tuesday afternoon, they would wonder, or even worse, they would ask. And so I would quickly rush back home and wait until people got off work at around 5 or 6 to do things like grocery shopping or going out to eat with a friend. The shame consumed me. I want you to think about that. We would rather pretend to work, appear to go to our jobs, rather than simply admit that we don't have a job. So, where did this employment model that came to dominate our lives and self concept even come from? Well, it wasn't handed down from the heavens. I know, hard to believe. It's actually a relatively recent invention, standardized during the Industrial Revolution and solidified with the American Labor Law and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Before that, work patterns varied widely by season. So, if you had work that season, you went to work. If you had work that day, you did your work and then went home. It was task oriented. The infamous Henry Ford was actually one of the first people to implement this. He was maybe the founder, if you will. And he did this because it was a vast improvement for factory workers who were used to grueling 12-hour shifts 6 days a week.
Tired of this, Grandpa? That's too damn bad!
The idea here was simple: structured shifts would equal more productive workers. And that was true for factory workers. But here's the problem: most of us don't work in factories anymore. We don't have a continuous stream of predictable tasks. And yet, companies still expect 8 straight hours of work 5 days a week. And like many of you may know, there isn't always that much work. So a lot of workers just end up stretching out whatever tasks they have to get through the day. Moreover, research consistently shows that productivity declines after a certain threshold. And that threshold is about 3 hours. So that leaves people with 5 to 6 hours of their workday kind of operating suboptimally. And you can't really take breaks in the office. And so you end up just sitting there, brain dead, trying to do a meaningless task. In this reality, we learn about what's really being valued. It's not creativity or output or productivity, it's visibility. It's being seen at your desk, even if you're just playing Scrabble or learning origami, both of which I've done. So here, the structured shifts equals more productivity doesn't really exist. It's structured shifts equals more conformity. And that's kind of what they want. Who's they, you may ask? Well, that's an episode for another day, and one you might call me a conspiracy theorist for. So we've clearly established the 9 to 5 isn't about productivity. So why does it still exist? Well, in short, it's still good for the economy. It creates predictable consumer patterns, it generates rush hour to justify massive transportation systems, and enables managerial classes to justify their existence with direct supervision. And perhaps most importantly, by consuming people's waking hours, pretty much all their waking hours, between the shift, the commuting, and the preparation, you don't really leave time for people to question the status quo, build political organizations, engage in hobbies or creativity, build communities, or really do anything outside of work. I've actually been having a lot of these conversations lately. So, people my age are finally getting into the corporate 9 to 5 or 9 to 6. And we talk about how between the commute there, the commute back, and being exhausted from work, you really don't do much else with your life. You get home, you barely have time to shower and eat, and then you go to sleep to be well rested for the next day of exhausting, deadening, and possibly meaningless work. And because your life is consumed with work, it becomes who you are. Think about it. When we're having a conversation with someone new, we don't ask, what do you love? What are you passionate about? What do you do for fun? What are you thinking about? We ask, what do you do for a living? And this wasn't the case for most of human history. I mean, if you think about it, a farmer back in the day wasn't having an existential crisis about whether growing wheat fulfilled his soul, and a fisherman, say, wasn't thinking maybe I should pivot into content creation because maybe that will be more fulfilling for me. Not at all. We simply treated jobs as a job, something we do to make a living, and then our lives and who we are were defined and shaped by external things like your relationships, what you do for fun, your hobbies, your extracurriculars. But the post industrial world changed that. Work became more than just survival. It became identity, status, and visibility. And most importantly, we have now structured our lives around labor rather than structuring labor around our lives. That would be a great segue into Gen Z's doomerism and existential angst, but I feel like that should be an episode for a different day because it is a very long winded conversation. So that was all really depressing. But where do we go from here? How do we change this? Well, first and foremost, we must recognize that unemployment is not a personal or moral failing. It's a perfectly normal economic condition. In fact, it's there by design, not by accident. The Federal Reserve actually explicitly uses unemployment to control inflation. And I mean, we're seeing it right now. Thousands upon thousands of people are being laid off in the matter of weeks, not because of their competence or moral standing, but simply because we have an inflated economic system. Second, we need to challenge the isolation that often accompanies unemployment. This isolation does nothing good. Yes, it is easier to hide the fact that we're unemployed, but that separates us from our social support network precisely when we need it the most. And not just our social support network, I mean our actual network of people who could possibly get us jobs or help us find a job. And finally, we need to fundamentally redefine what gives human life value. I know it's sappy, it's redundant, it's oversaid, but we've said it a lot and we haven't actually done it. I mean, what is society but the people it's made out of? I thought I was going to say something like really clever, but it just didn't come out, so just bear with me. We do. We need to fundamentally redefine what gives us value. And it is easier said than done. I've grappled with this for the past year, even over a year. And some days I'm fine and some days I'm not. And I feel this crushing shame. But as we've learned in this video, nearly 50% of people, or even more, because I believe the number is an underrepresentation, if more than 50% of us believe that our jobs are meaningless, then we shouldn't let their absence diminish our personal value and worth. What if, crazy thought, what if we started measuring our worth by kindness instead of productivity, by connections instead of resumes, by contributions to community rather than corporations? As we conclude, I want us to envision a world where we move beyond the constraints of the 9 to 5 work model. Globally, we're already seeing experiments with alternatives. For example, Iceland is doing a 4-day work week and has witnessed no drop in productivity. In fact, I'd argue in a few years, if we checked back in, they'd probably be even more productive than they already are. What they did find is improved well being, and a happy worker is a more productive worker, right? I think so. Spain had a similar pilot program for a 32-hour work week, and they didn't reduce pay, and they found the same results. Productivity did not decline, and worker satisfaction increased drastically. These examples suggest that we can live in a world where work serves human needs rather than humans serving work's needs, where productivity is measured by outcome and outputs rather than hours spent, where the purpose of technological advancements is reduced working hours rather than additional output. I want you to remember, and I want myself to remember, that unemployment is not a moral failing. It's a perfectly normal part of our economic system, as we've said, and I'm getting redundant. And the real failing here would be continuing to define our worth by these meaningless jobs. Sounded like I had more to say. I was actually just concluded. I'm concluded. I'm concluded, and this episode is concluding. I'm your host, Anya Salah. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Ish Matters. This is my first one on YouTube. I was so excited and nervous to produce it, so I hope you liked it and it was good and helpful. And if you found it useful, I'm glitching now because I'm concluded, as we've established. If you found it useful, please click share it with someone who's going through unemployment or who feels a certain way about unemployment. And I cannot wait to see you next time here on this channel.